I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The words echo through military induction ceremonies across America, spoken by young men and women pledging their lives to protect their nation. Cut to 4 prison cells. 4 men who spoke those same words. 4 men who broke that sacred oath in the most horrific ways possible. They swore to protect America. Instead, they became its most dangerous enemies. Welcome to Savage Case Files, where we expose the most shocking betrayals, brutal crimes, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Today's episode: the complete list of every prisoner currently sentenced to death by the U.S. military. As of 2025, only 4 men sit on America's military death row. 4 soldiers who turned their weapons against the very people they swore to protect. 4 cases that represent the darkest betrayals in military history. From fragging fellow officers in Kuwait to mass murder at Fort Hood. From serial killing at Fort Bragg to family annihilation, we'll examine every case. Every crime, every year these men have spent waiting to die. Some have been on death row for nearly 4 decades. Others for over a decade. None have been executed. This isn't civilian death row, this is military justice, for military crimes. Courts martial, not civilian courts. Military law, not civilian law. The question that haunts every case: how do soldiers become the enemy? 4 cases, 4 betrayals, 4 death sentences that may never be carried out. Case by case, we'll reveal how America's protectors became America's condemned. Case 1. Ronald Adrian Gray. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, 1986. Home to the 82nd Airborne Division and Special Operations Command, this sprawling military installation represented the pinnacle of American military might. Among the thousands of soldiers stationed there was Ronald Adrian Gray, a man who had transformed from protector to predator in the most devastating way possible. Gray appeared to be the model soldier. His military records showed no red flags, no disciplinary issues, no warning signs that would suggest the monster lurking beneath the uniform. He blended seamlessly into military life. Just another face among the ranks of America's finest. But between 1986 and 1987, Gray embarked on a reign of terror that would forever change how military communities viewed their own safety. He systematically hunted, raped, and murdered multiple women in the areas surrounding Fort Bragg. These weren't random acts of violence. They were methodical attacks by someone who used his military training as a weapon against innocent civilians. Gray's victims were women who lived near the base, many connected to military families. They had chosen to live in these communities because military installations represented safety and security. Gray shattered that trust completely, turning the protection of military presence into a hunting ground for his twisted desires. The investigation that followed involved both military and civilian law enforcement working together to track down one of their own. Evidence mounted against Gray through DNA analysis, witness testimony, and physical evidence that painted a horrifying picture of systematic violence. When Gray was finally brought before a military tribunal, the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple counts of murder and rape. Multiple families destroyed. Multiple communities terrorized by someone who had sworn to protect them. The court-martial resulted in a death sentence that made Gray the longest-serving military death row inmate in American history. For 37 years and 40 days, he has lived in a cell at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. In 2008, his execution was approved by military authorities, but it was stayed at the last moment. Gray has now outlived some of his victims' family members while continuing to appeal his sentence through the military justice system. Case 2. Hassan Karim Akbar. March 23, 2003. Camp, Pennsylvania, Kuwait. American forces were preparing for the invasion of Iraq as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom. In the pre-dawn darkness of the Kuwaiti desert, soldiers slept in their tents, trusting that their fellow Americans would keep them safe. Hassan Karim Akbar had other plans. Akbar was an American soldier, deployed with his unit to support the upcoming military operations. He wore the same uniform, saluted the same flag, and had taken the same oath as every other service member in that camp. But on that fateful night, he would commit the ultimate military betrayal. Armed with grenades and small arms, Akbar launched a devastating attack on his own officers. He specifically targeted commissioned officers, the leaders of his unit, the men who commanded and guided American forces. 2 officers were killed instantly, while multiple others suffered severe wounds from the explosions and gunfire. This wasn't battlefield confusion or friendly fire. This was fragging. The deliberate murder of military leaders by their own subordinates. Akbar had planned and executed an attack designed to kill as many American officers as possible. The immediate response was swift and decisive. Military police secured the scene and captured Akbar before he could escape or cause further casualties. The shock throughout the military ranks was profound. How do you process that? One of your own just murdered your leaders. The Military Criminal Investigation Command took over the case, uncovering evidence of premeditation and planning. This wasn't a moment of battlefield stress or psychological breakdown. Akbar had deliberately chosen to kill his fellow Americans while they prepared to fight America's enemies. His court-martial revealed the full scope of his betrayal. Multiple murder charges, testimony from survivors who had trusted him with their lives, evidence of his methodical planning to maximize casualties among American officers. The military tribunal sentenced Akbar to death for his crimes. For 20 years and 99 days, he has remained on military death row, a symbol of the ultimate military betrayal. His attack didn't just kill soldiers, it killed the fundamental trust that holds military units together. Case 3. Timothy B. Hennis. The Eastburn family home became the scene of one of the most brutal crimes in military history. Catherine Eastburn and her 2 young daughters were raped and murdered in an attack so vicious it shocked even experienced investigators. The perpetrator was Army Sergeant Timothy B. Hennis, a man who wore the same uniform as Catherine's deployed husband. The initial investigation led to Hennis being tried in civilian court. Despite compelling evidence, the civilian jury acquitted him, leaving the Eastburn family devastated and justice seemingly denied. For years, it appeared that Hennis had escaped punishment for his horrific crimes. But the military justice system had a different perspective. Hennis was active-duty military at the time of the murders, which meant the case fell under military jurisdiction. Unlike civilian courts, military law allowed for a retrial even after acquittal. Double jeopardy protections work differently under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Years after his civilian acquittal, Hennis found himself facing a military court-martial for the same crimes. This time, military investigators had access to advanced forensic techniques and evidence that hadn't been available during the original trial. The military tribunal heard testimony about the systematic rape and murder of a military family by one of their own. The evidence presented to the military court was overwhelming. DNA analysis, witness testimony, and physical evidence painted a clear picture of Hennis's guilt. The military panel found him guilty on all charges and sentenced him to death. For 15 years and 115 days, Hennis has remained on military death row, his case representing a unique legal precedent. He was acquitted by civilian courts, but condemned by military justice, proving that military law has a longer reach than civilian courts when it comes to crimes committed by service members. The Eastburn family's journey from civilian acquittal to military death sentence spans decades of legal proceedings. What civilian courts couldn't accomplish, military justice achieved, though the execution has yet to be carried out. Hennis's case changed how military jurisdiction is applied and demonstrated that service members cannot escape military justice simply by being acquitted in civilian courts. Case 4. Nidal Malik Hassan. November 5, 2009, Fort Hood, Texas. The Soldier Readiness Processing Center was filled with troops preparing for deployment to Afghanistan and Iraq. These soldiers were completing final medical and administrative requirements before heading overseas to serve their country. Among them walked Major Nidal Malik Hassan, an Army psychiatrist whose job was to help soldiers cope with the psychological stresses of war. Instead, Hassan brought war to them. At 1:34 p.m., Hassan entered the processing center armed with 2 handguns. What happened next would become the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. military history. Shouting, "Allahu Akbar!" Hassan opened fire on unarmed soldiers who had no way to defend themselves. In just 10 minutes, Hassan systematically murdered 13 people and wounded 30 others. His victims were soldiers preparing to deploy, medical personnel, and civilian employees. These were people who trusted him as a fellow officer, a medical professional, someone sworn to protect and heal. The attack ended when civilian police officers Sergeant Kimberly Munley and Senior Sergeant Mark Todd arrived and engaged Hassan in a firefight. Hassan was shot multiple times and paralyzed, but survived to face military justice. The investigation revealed years of radicalization and communication with terrorist organizations. Hassan had transformed from a healer of soldiers' minds into their destroyer. His attack wasn't a moment of breakdown. It was a planned act of terrorism against his own military. His court-martial was unprecedented in many ways. Hassan chose to represent himself, turning the proceedings into a platform for his extremist views. Despite his attempts to disrupt the trial, the evidence was overwhelming. 13 counts of premeditated murder. 32 counts of attempted murder. The military panel sentenced Hassan to death for his crimes. For 11 years and 345 days, he has remained on military death row, paralyzed from the waist down, but alive, while his 13 victims remain dead. Hassan's attack changed how the military views internal threats and security screening. The man who was supposed to prepare soldiers mentally for combat instead became the face of military terrorism from within. 4 men, 4 cells, 4 death sentences that spanned nearly 4 decades of combined time on military death row. As of 2025, these represent the complete list of prisoners sentenced to death by the U.S. military justice system. A number so small, it's almost shocking compared to civilian death row populations across America. Ronald Gray has been waiting 37 years and 40 days for his execution, longer than some of his victims lived their entire lives. Hassan Akbar has spent over 20 years in military confinement. Timothy Hennis has been condemned for 15 years. Nidal Hassan has lived with his death sentence for nearly 12 years. Combined, these 4 men represent over 85 years of time spent awaiting executions that may never come. The military death penalty exists in a legal limbo unlike anything in civilian justice. Every military execution requires presidential approval, a level of oversight that doesn't exist in state death penalty cases. The appeals process moves through the Military Court of Criminal Appeals. then the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, potentially to the Supreme Court, and finally to the President for clemency consideration. This complex system means military death sentences are rarely carried out. The last military execution occurred in 1961, over 6 decades ago. Since then, military death row has become a place where condemned soldiers live out their natural lives, while their cases move through endless appeals. At the U.S. disciplinary barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, these 4 men exist in a world apart from both civilian prisoners and regular military inmates. They live under the constant shadow of death sentences that may never be fulfilled, in a system that condemns but rarely executes. For the families of their victims, this creates a unique form of torture. Decades pass with promises of justice that never materialize. The officers killed in Kuwait, the women murdered at Fort Bragg, the Eastburn family, and the 13 soldiers massacred at Fort Hood. Their families continue waiting for final closure that may never come. The debate over military capital punishment continues, with some arguing these sentences should be carried out, and others questioning whether the military should have the power to execute its own members at all. 4 men who broke their sacred oath to defend America now sit in cells, waiting to pay the ultimate price for their betrayals. Ronald Gray, the longest-serving military death row inmate at 37 years. Hassan Akbar, who murdered his own officers in Kuwait. Timothy Hennes, condemned by military justice after civilian courts failed. Nidal Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter who turned healing into horror. These cases raise fundamental questions about military justice and the death penalty. Should these sentences be carried out after decades of appeals? Or does the prolonged process itself constitute cruel punishment? Does the military justice system work when death sentences are imposed but never executed? Which of these cases shocked you the most? The serial killer who terrorized Fort Bragg for years? The soldier who fragged his own officers in a combat zone? The family annihilator who escaped civilian justice only to face military condemnation? Or the psychiatrist who massacred the soldiers he was supposed to heal? Do these men deserve execution? Or has their decades in military prison already served as sufficient punishment? Should the president authorize these long-delayed executions, or commute their sentences to life imprisonment? Remember the victims whose lives were stolen by these betrayers of military trust. The officers killed in Kuwait who died at the hands of their own subordinate. The women murdered near Fort Bragg by someone sworn to protect civilians. The Eastburn family destroyed by a fellow soldier. The 13 Fort Hood victims gunned down while preparing to serve their country. Their families have waited decades for final justice, watching as appeals drag on year after year while their loved ones' killers continue to live. This has been Savage Case Files, exposing the darkest betrayals in American military history. Subscribe for more cases that reveal how those sworn to protect can become the most dangerous predators of all. 4 men broke their oath to America. 4 men now wait to discover if military justice will finally be served, or if they'll die of old age before facing the executioner they've avoided for decades. The question remains, will these death sentences ever be carried out? Or will military death row remain America's most exclusive life sentence?